when I started teaching in the 1960s, I couldn't believe I was getting paid to have so much fun. But things have changed a lot in the last few decades. Some of it obviously because of changes in technology, but the role of teachers has changed dramatically as a result of policy decisions that have been made. When it goes back to the late 19th century, and when mass education was first, compulsory education was first introduced into Australia, it was based on a Prussian model. And the Prussian model was one related to the Industrial Revolution. They said, oh, we need a workforce that's layered. And so they used a timetable that said every student will spend a year at that level, and then another year, and then another year, and then another year. And some of them couldn't keep up, and those failures were really important because they would do the unskilled work, and it kind of gave the Prussians a rationale for having unskilled work. The Australian states, the United States and the UK copied it. It worked quite well in Australia because Australia had a lot of unskilled labour, a shortage of unskilled labour in fact, right through to the 1980s when technology interfered, if you like, with the model. And what that technology did, it really got rid of unskilled work. So there was a kind of, what would we call it? A parting of the ways, a possible two different pathways that could be taken. One was, we'll get rid of the competitive model and create a model a bit like a driver's license where you give everybody the time to achieve what's important to live fully in society, or you could make the competitive model even stronger. In other words, really push it. And unfortunately, it was that last one that happened. They said, well, if it's not working, we'll just do it harder. And as a result, in Australia, they followed the global education reform movement, as Pasi Sahlberger, a Finnish educator, calls it. And what that meant was highly centralised education, a curriculum delivered, if you like, to schools down a chain of command with teachers at the bottom end. Teachers became operatives rather than professional people who were able to, in the past, tailor their teaching to meet the needs of individual kids and the talents of individual kids and the local environment. And now they actually are forced to deliver, in the last step in a chain of command, a curriculum that was designed years earlier in another place. Now, in Australia in 2006, every state and territory government was a Labor government. The federal government was the Liberal Party, and Julie Bishop was the Minister for Education. And she got pretty spooked by the idea of Labor Party ideologues kind of controlling the curriculum. It wasn't really true, because a lot of the ideology actually began well before the Labor Party got in. But she came forward with the idea that there should be a national curriculum to overcome really the Labor Party's perceived role in education. And so she proposed a national curriculum or an Australian curriculum. Some of her own party members at the time called it a recipe for disaster. But nevertheless, an Australian curriculum was created. 11 teams of curriculum writers covering 11 different subject areas created a curriculum based on ages, so that, you're in year 5, so you've got to do South America sort of thing. And it really became quite rigid, although initially the writers said, well, it's just a guide. Schools can adapt it to their own circumstances and context. But that didn't happen. And it really became something that was almost like a mandate. Now, the problem with that was several problems. First, it changed teachers' roles. They became the last in the chain of command, if you like, delivering a curriculum. But more vitally than that, because it was year-based, many students, by say year 9, were sick of being told year after year after year, you're not keeping up, you're failing, if you like, or you're a loser. What's the emotionally most intelligent thing to do if you've been called a loser for 8 or 9 years for playing that game? Well, the most intelligent thing is don't play the game anymore. So many students disengage, and in that disengagement, they seek ways of being winners rather than losers, stirring teachers, the lower end, but at the higher end it's things like graffiti and hooning in cars and youth crime even. For teachers, of course, behaviour in classes started to get worse because there were many students disengaging. Australia, in fact, is one of the very few countries in the world that has a 10-year compulsory curriculum. Now, the interesting thing is that the big decline in people applying to become teachers happened in 2016, and that was the first year that students had gone through the national curriculum, were attempting to enter university and so on. And there was a huge drop-off in 2016 in the number of teachers or the number of people applying to be teachers.
So, Mike, I wanted to ask you, after this interesting life and discussions about the past in education, today in Tasmania we're looking at the future of education, and it's obviously not in a very good place with such a high percentage of illiterate students. And I wanted to ask you, out of all of your experience and thoughts about it, for people who are watching this video, what is the easiest things that could be implemented immediately that might make a difference, and through to the hardest things? And secondly, who are the people that can make these decisions? So that's easiest through to hardest, and then who would be the decision makers?
Well, I think the easiest a necessary starting point is to return autonomy to teachers, give them the chance to make many more decisions. But that also introduces the hard bit, because there's, a whole generation of teachers now that have gone through under a national curriculum model where they see themselves as being responsible to a hierarchy, if you like, to deliver a curriculum to students. What needs to change, first of all, is that teachers are given the responsibility and the opportunity to tailor their courses to meet the needs of their students. Now, the problem with that, or the problem that goes along with that, is that their students have a wide range of interests and abilities, inevitably. But it makes it worse at the moment because it's a year-based curriculum. And a year-based curriculum is crazy because students are at all sorts of different levels of achievement in different subjects. Just because they're at the same age doesn't mean they're at the same stage in their development. So the second thing that needs to happen is that schools need to look for ways of creating a continuous journey, if you like, instead of it being a race where the time is fixed and you've got to get through in this amount of time. It needs to be changed to like the metaphor of a journey where the students have time and opportunity to achieve goals. And that means often a significant change in the way schools are structured. As the Gonski 2 report said, we need to get rid of this lockstep age-based system. And it also acknowledges that school structures inhibit innovation. And they're the things that need to change. I guess the worst thing that could happen is that politicians see something good happening in one school and say, oh, well, that's working, let everyone do that. I mean, that's just bureaucracy on steroids. It has to be bottom-up reform and not top-down. The job of politicians and bureaucrats is to enable, to open up, to encourage innovation, not to have a chain of command telling teachers what they have to do and filling in scores of paperwork, or it's not paperwork now, but computer programs that say, this is what we're going to do. I mean, if you ask a teacher to say, well, I want your lesson plans for the next term, and the teacher says, well, some of the things I want to do depend on the weather, because I might use the outside environment and so on. They cannot possibly do that. Lesson plans need to be day after day after day. The lesson plan on Thursday has to depend upon where they finished up on Wednesday, not on some great calendar that's set out, which is just crazy. So teachers need more autonomy and they need less paperwork to justify their accountability to the chain of command, if you like. Their accountability needs to be returned to their students and their community.
So, Mike, a lot of your work, I've noticed in your book, has centred around timetabling. Is timetabling a way of assisting this situation where students can work at their own rate? I mean, could we just get timetabling worked out in each individual school to assist children to learn at their own rate?
Yes, that's true. During the 1980s, when the unskilled work basically disappeared, there were many schools in Australia, secondary and primary, that worked on structures to give students the amount of time. There were, in fact, Kim Beazley report from Western Australia, a McGowan report from New South Wales. They're both secondary reports that said students need the time. So where some students would take, there were terms at that stage that were 3-term years, and they would take, say, 12 terms of maths to get to their finish. Others might take 15, others might take 9, and that was totally appropriate. However, that global education reform movement, that economic rationalism that happened in the 90s, poured cold water on that, and then the national curriculum that came out with year-based slices in the curriculum made it even harder. However, if we are prepared to challenge that notion of year-based curriculum, in fact, in both primary and secondary schools, there are very simple and available models that give students the time they need to learn. One of the things that used to happen was that because it was age-based, if teachers wanted similar abilities in their class, they would stream the class. Now, what that meant was usually that a kid would be in a top stream all the way through high school, or they'd be in the bottom stream all the way through, and that was really reproducing those social effects. But in fact, what needs to be realised is that streaming is a function of year grouping. If you don't year group, you don't have to stream. It means that every student is on the same journey, albeit at different stages of the journey. And we go back there to things like learning the piano, or learning to dance, or learning to drive a car. Outside of the school setting, it's obvious that people have to learn depending on what they've learnt before. As a scout leader, I knew that. The scouts would gradually move through second class, first class, Queen Scout, depending on their development. Outside of formal schooling, learning is like that, and we need to change schooling to fit that kind of model. Under those circumstances, and most government schools in Tasmania, in fact in Australia, have composite classes. Now, people see composite classes as a negative. A lot of teachers and parents, I don't want a composite class. But in fact, if we look at it differently, the composite class can be a mechanism whereby we can give students more time to go through, so they don't have to go through in those year-long slabs while we've got those sort of overlapping composites. They can, it wouldn't be like repeating a year. They can take a year longer or a year shorter without those social disadvantages of losing their friends or having their self-esteem challenged, because every year they'll be with students who were with them the previous year. There's a particular model that a lot of Queensland schools used in the 90s called a stage-based model of education. And in that model, primary school students could take 6, 7 or 8 years to complete primary school. Now, many of you might say taking 8 years, well, that's a bit tough. But when you look at it, you find a student taking 8 years might only be a week older than other students who took 7 years because of the way the age system works in primary education.
So we still do have a very high level of literacy here in Tasmania. So obviously things are not happening. To me, that's an emergency situation, because we're going to face a generation of 10 years without a lot of people who can't even read a voting card to vote. It's urgent, and that's what I'm asking you. What can we do that will urgently tackle these issues? What's the first steps we could do?
Well, the problem is what politicians will look for is a simple, superficial way, like saying that all primary school students should do 1 hour of maths and 1 hour of literacy every day. That's not going to fix anything, because actually both numeracy and literacy need to be embedded in a much wider context. So, for example, there's a very strong correlation between music and mathematics, a very strong correlation between art and drama, and even dance, and things like poetry and literacy. There's a rhythm in language, and there's a rhythm in mathematics. And to see literacy and numeracy as separate issues that need to be taught on their own is to misunderstand how learning takes place. One of the worst things, of course, is that NAPLAN hasn't helped, because what NAPLAN has done is encourage schools to focus tightly in on, or some schools to focus tightly in on literacy and numeracy, and that's only made it worse, because for the students it's taken the whole learning of literacy and numeracy into areas that are irrelevant to them and that just sit on their own and don't seem to have a real life in the wider world.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And with multi-schools in Tasmania, I think this has recently been discussed here. Do you believe that's a good thing, or how should it be done?
Look, if it's just another layer in the bureaucracy, like putting 3 schools together because they're close or whatever, I think that's not terribly helpful. But if the schools that are clustered together in that multi-school approach are together interested in a particular kind of initiative, like getting rid of the lockstep structure, or changing the assessment processes so there's a much more continuous program, or embedding their literacy and their numeracy more fully in the whole curriculum, that would be a much better way of clustering those schools together, because that would give a better chance for a bottom-up initiatives to take place. Although little sparks of colour in the greyness, if you like. Whereas if we just group them together randomly, the greyness stays. If we allow them to be grouped together according to initiatives they want to take, then there'll be colours growing and there'll be diversity and schools learning from each other. quite often when people talk about equity in education, particularly in the political field, they talk about funding. But it's not just about funding. In fact, in some ways, more fun, if the system itself is designed to name winners and losers, more funding will just do that more effectively. So let's think about a national curriculum and the effect of a national curriculum on the whole issue of equity. If we decided we wanted to clothe every year one student in Australia, would we give them the same size coat, for example? Of course we wouldn't, because they have different shapes and they have different heights and they have different weights. It would be stupid to give them all the same size coat. Now, if they're different in their physical, visible characteristics, it would be crazy to think they're not going to be different in the way they think. Some will be more curious than others. Some will have different interests from others. Their quirkiness comes home. It came home to me when my grandson had to be homeschooled during the first year of COVID, and I decided with him that I'd teach him a little bit of algebra. I'd introduce him to algebra. So I said, hey, listen, if x plus 8 is 11, what do you reckon x is? And he looked at me with this disdainful look. He said, oh, give me a bit of paper and a pencil. He said, I'll give you one, Pop. And after 5 minutes, this is what he gave me. When I looked at what he handed me, I just couldn't believe it. It was about year 10 standard, simultaneous equations, obviously, with a quadratic involved. And I said to him, where did you learn that? Who taught you that? And he looked at me with a strange look. He said, what do you mean? I said, who taught you that stuff? He said, oh, nobody taught me to. I'm just interested in that sort of stuff. So, you know, I like mucking around with numbers and things like that. So I talked to my grandson 4 years later and asked him what he thought of maths.
I don't really like the Australian curriculum because it doesn't fit people's needs. For example, maths used to be my favourite subject in primary school and when I was being homeschooled. But now that I'm in year 7, it's probably my least favourite subject, because what they do is they give you a textbook and a pencil and a worksheet, and they say, this is the curriculum for year 7. Everyone's got to do this textbook. And then that's what you do. And I don't like it because it doesn't fit people's needs and it doesn't fit to where their level is at and their interests. And the worst part is that I have to do the same thing for year 7, year 8, year 9, and even year 10. And I just don't feel like that's the right thing to do.
So kids vary widely in their quirkiness. For me, it seems tragic for my grandson to have those abilities that he's got, and now he finds maths boring because he's got to do what everyone else does. That's a major problem with delivering a common curriculum to the 2 or 3 million school kids, more than that, 5 million school kids in Australia. It's very different from when I started teaching, because every evening in the shower or wherever I was, it was like choosing a present, a Christmas present for the kids the next day. I knew the kids and I knew what they were up to and what would excite them next. So it was things like taking them down beside a river and saying, "How wide's the river?" And they said, "Oh, we can't get across. It's too wide and it's deep anyway and there's a current." I'd say, "But you don't need to get across." And I'd hand them a measuring thing and a compass and I'd say, "I'll come back in an hour and see if you can work out how wide the river is." Or I'd say to another group, "How tall do you reckon that eucalypt is?" And they'd say, "Oh, we can't climb it." I'd say, "Yeah, but it's got a shadow." And they'd say, "Oh, can we use that?" I'd say, "Think about it." Or in chemistry, you know, I was trying to teach them that some metals are stronger than other metals. And so, for example, if copper's dancing with chlorine, and I'd get them dancing in class, I'd say, "Okay, this boy's a copper and this girl's a chlorine." I'd say, "Well, iron's stronger than copper." And so the iron boy would come up and tap the copper boy on the shoulder and say, "Hey, I'm taking over here." And the kids would laugh and they would love it, but it taught them so much chemistry because they loved it. And my relationship with them was not of a judge, because there was an external exam at the end and I was like a coach preparing them for the grand final, you know. It was a totally different kind of relationship. But it's not only the quirkiness that they inherit from their parents, there's also a quirkiness because of their social background. When I'd been working on the west coast of Tasmania with a whole lot of bush cutters, I was a geologist, I decided I wanted to do something different, and it's a long story, but I thought, no, I'm going to be a teacher. I had no training at all, and they sent me to, they were short of science teachers, and so even though I had no training, they said, "Oh, you can start at Queenstown, which is a mining town, next week." And the first lesson, the head of science came in, he said, "You need to teach this year 9 class, mainly boys they are, the human alimentary canal." He said, "Here's a book. It's a book called Human Biology, and it's chapter 13 is the one about the alimentary canal." Well, I went in, I had a look at these kids and I thought, I'm not sure they're going to be interested in reading that chapter. I've worked with their dads for quite a while. I'll take a different approach. So I took a vegetable knife and an apple into the room and I said, after I'd introduced myself and all that, I said, "Do you reckon you kids could eat a bit of apple hanging upside down on the bars out there, on those parallel bars?" And some of them said, "Of course you couldn't, because you got brains." And said they'll talk to you, you know, speak for yourself. So I didn't have very good, control, but it didn't matter because they were so interested. And I said, "Well, hands up those who reckon you could." About half of them put their hands up. "Hands up those who reckon you couldn't." The other half put their hands up. I said, "All right, we've got 2 theories or hypotheses, as scientists would call it. How do you reckon they work out who's right?" "Don't know." "Come on, we'll go out and try it." Well, wide-eyed amazement. "We're going outside." And so we went outside and I cut up pieces of apple and some of the boys were hanging upside down eating the apples. Some were lying on the sloped edge of the oval, and the principal came out and said, "I think you need some teacher training." But when I took them back into the classroom, they said, "So how does that happen? I just thought you ate it and and it fell into your tummy. How does it do the other thing? And so I was explaining a bit like toothpaste, you can squeeze it upwards. Anyway, at the end of the lesson, as the kids left the room, I heard one of them say to another, "Well, I'll be buggered." And I thought, straight away, I'm hooked here. It's just lovely being able to communicate, if you like, with those kids. So teaching is only equitable when it's tailored to the needs socially and individually of individual students. So we need to, again, give teachers the power to do that, to tailor their lessons for their students and not blindly follow a delivered curriculum.